We've seen already today some of the basic principles of economics and basic concepts from which those principles stem. We talked about ends, that action is designed to attain, the means that are employed in acting towards those ends. We've seen that means can be divided into goods of lower order, consumer goods that are directly capable of satisfying ends, and then goods of higher order, producer goods that are only indirectly capable of satisfying ends. We talked a little bit about the causal laws that connect the means to the ends. This is in what is called the capital structure, or the structure of production, that Dr. Salerno mentioned in his lecture. That first we have to engage in initial extraction of natural resources, and then through progressive sequence of productive activity, create capital goods of greater sophistication, mining iron first, and then making steel, and then making fenders for automobiles, let's say, and then eventually can construct consumer goods. And we've also talked about, at least to some extent, the laws of valuation, how we value things in action. And we've touched upon the principles of appraisement, by which entrepreneurs are able to make calculations of monetary profit and loss so that resources can be allocated within a division of labor. In this lecture, we want to add the concept of time to our discussion. And we might begin just by talking about the basic principles that are introduced by incorporating time into our discussion. We know that action aims at attaining ends at some future point. When we decide to act at the moment, we cannot, by that decision, realize our end. Action takes time. And the passage of time also implies change. And since we're finite beings who don't comprehend fully the natural world and all of its cause and effect relationships, this change can be not perfectly predictable. We can be uncertain about whether or not, or to what degree, our action that we are undertaking now will in fact realize our end. So just with the introduction of the notion of time, we get both the concept of uncertainty, that through the passage of time, since things can change in ways that are not fully predictable, the future is uncertain. And we likewise recognize, once we recognize that since by our own reflection on our own actions, we realize that sometimes our actions succeed and sometimes they fail, or sometimes they succeed to greater degrees or to lesser degrees, that we must have some human capacity to deal with this uncertainty. We must, as actors, be able to some degree, to penetrate this uncertainty and to make expectations or to formulate anticipations that are by and large accurate enough for our actions to turn out successful. This we call entrepreneurship. So entrepreneurship is just that set of human skills by which we deal with the uncertainty of the future when we act. And those are topics for later discussion. Because in this lecture we want to focus, as Dr. Thornton said, on time preference and interest. Now, a few other basic concepts here. We can identify what we might call the period of production. This is the time from the beginning of an action until the end is attained. A period of production can be broken down into working time. These are the stages of production that we mentioned before in the structure of production, where we're working in order to create the consumer good. And then there can also be, in some production processes at least, maturing time. This would be the time between taking an action and having the effects of that action manifest themselves. So an obvious example would be fermenting wine or something. So we can usefully use this concept of the period of production. Another useful concept to us that arises because of time is what Mises calls the duration of serviceableness of a good. Or sometimes what, in short, we just call durability of the good. So this is the time over which the good generates services. And there can be greater or lesser degrees of durability of goods. Now, it should be pointed out that these concepts, the period of production and the duration of serviceableness, are praxeological concepts. They're not concepts whose main application is in historical work. They're concepts by which we act. Because every time we act into the future, we take account of both the period of production, when we're valuing things, and the duration of the serviceableness of the goods involved in the production process. So let me give you just one example of this. My wife and I are currently building a house in Grove City, and if all went well, they broke ground today. Now, from the time they break ground to the time they finish the house, this would be at least part of the period of production, is estimated to be 4 months. And then the duration of the serviceableness of the house, I hope is decades. 30 years or 40 years that the house would be serviceable. And without knowing this, without being able to anticipate these two elements of the action, a proper valuation could not be undertaken. I could not properly choose to put into motion this action. Right? What if the period of production and the duration of serviceableness were reversed? So it took 40 years to build the house and it lasted for 4 months. Well, then I wouldn't build the house. So these are, again, praxeological concepts. They're necessary parts of the conceptual framework by which we theorize about action. They're useful for historical analysis, but mainly they're theoretical concepts. Then one last concept that we can define, that Mises defines for us, is what he calls the period of provision. And this is the time over which a person, by acting, provides for the future. So in different actions, we can have different periods of provision. So we can, let's say, just provide for our daily meals. That period of provision is perhaps short. Or we can provide for our newborn child's college education. We can begin doing that today, where the period of provision is decades hence. Now, as Mises argues, in thinking about the value of time and this idea of time preference, the operative distinction is sooner and later, is what matters when we're talking about preferring or valuing time, is whether or not the end, or the satisfaction of attaining the end, will occur sooner in time or later in time. We are not, because of the unique features of time, which I'll mention in a minute, we're not in a position to be able to apply the notion of more or less time. The correct way of viewing it is always sooner or later. Now, Mises uses this phrase. He says the reason for this is because time is an irreversible flux. Time just passes on. And in that sense, it is different than other elements of our action. And in fact, since time just passes on, it's apparent that we cannot own time. It lacks the good characteristic that Dr. Salerno talked about from Menger's exposition. We cannot control it and use it as a means. For this reason, of course, we cannot allocate it. We cannot allocate time because we cannot own it. We cannot choose, for example, to use just because we're enjoying the day, today's events. We can't choose to use, say, 30 hours of time in this day, or extra time like we do labor or money or other goods that are available to us. So we're not able to allocate time. Time is, we might say this differently, time is not a factor of production. It's not an element of production. Now, and we'll see the ramifications of these points later in the lecture. Now, let me mention one last of these basic concepts. And this is the principle of economizing time. As we talked about before, when we engage in action, we always strive to economize. Strive to attain the highest valued ends with our given means, or attain a given end with the least cost means. And of course, this involves allocating those means across different actions that we might engage in. But we've seen that this isn't possible with time. We can't allocate time in this way. This doesn't mean that we can't economize on time. It just means that we can't economize in the same way that we economize with ownable factors of production. The way in which we economize time is to prioritize our actions in time. We might call this the timing of our actions. So we decide to do this particular action now, as opposed to later. We do it sooner, or at this point in time, as opposed to later on, or at some other point in time. And it's crucial to keep in mind this point, because it's distinguishable from time preference. Economizing time, again, is just prioritizing your actions in time. Time preference has to do with this distinction, as we mentioned before, between sooner and later, and not when in time some action will be performed. Those are two different elements to valuing time. Now let's turn our attention to time preference. Time preference is the preference that people have for the satisfaction of an end sooner to the same satisfaction later in time. That is, any particular satisfaction that we might attain, we prefer to attain it sooner in time as opposed to later in time. If we paid no attention at all to sooner and later, then we undertake certain actions which we do not in fact undertake. For example, we would always choose the most productive process for production, no matter how long it took. Because more of a good is always preferred to less. So if we can extend the production process in time, making it more productive by building up more capital in the process and so on, then we would always undertake the production in this fashion. We would never search for shorter periods of production. But again, we don't do this, right? We do, in fact, always strive toward any end through production with the shortest, most productive process. In fact, we can even point out that the farther out in time, that is, the later in time that an end is to be achieved, the heavier the discount that we place on it. Not only is sooner preferred to later, but even later is less preferred to later on. If this weren't true, then we could have infinite time horizons. We could actually plan for actions infinitely into the future. Obviously, we don't do this. So it must be the case that we have time preference. In fact, if we did not have time preference, then it would be possible, at least for us, to have infinite periods of provision as well, right? To anticipate seeing out into the future an end that we might strive for into an indefinite future. But clearly action, any action, demonstrates that we don't have infinite time horizons, that we're not delaying our action into the future infinitely, but instead we're acting now in the present. And this, of course, occurs even, this point stands even when we take into consideration the economizing of time, when we're simply timing our actions to occur in the future. So, for example, when you applied to come to this conference at Mises U, there was a certain timing involved in that action. Right? So you couldn't, when you applied last March, let's say, you couldn't attain this end sooner as opposed to later. You time it so that it occurs in this week. That's just the nature of the action, right? So you accept that as part of the prioritizing of what you will do in time. So again, we need to keep distinct these two valuing processes of time. Or we could think about another way to think about this is to think about consumption itself. Present consumption demonstrates that a present good is preferred to the same good's consumption in the future. Every time we engage in an act of consumption, we do so because we exhibit time preference. If future goods were preferred to present goods, then of course we would always delay our consumption. We would never consume, right? Because when tomorrow came, then the future consumption would be preferred again. If we had no time preference at all, instead of preferring the future to the present, if we were indifferent between the future and the present, then there would still be no consumption in the present, because we would devote all of our efforts, instead of to consumption, we would devote all of our efforts to producing goods through long production processes so we could have more consumer goods in the future, since more is always preferred to less. Now, time preference, like these other concepts that we've spoken about, these periods of provision and production and so on, is a praxeological concept. That is, it stems just from the logic of acting, right? We act, we're exhibiting time preference by acting in the present. It's not a psychological concept. It isn't, when we talk about time preference, we're not speaking about impatience or the disutility of waiting or some other such thing. We're not denying that those things can exist. Time preference is just something else. In fact, Mises, in one part of Human Action, points out that even animals have time preference. Time preference is not physiological. It's not based upon the fact that there are certain consumptive acts that we must undertake in order to extend our lives. Even when all of those are satisfied, we still have time preference. We still prefer sooner satisfaction of a given end to later satisfaction of that same end. Now, when we want to couple time preference with another principle that we find in reality, which is that goods with the shortest periods of production do not satisfy all of our ends. Goods with the shortest periods of production are picking apples off trees and catching fish in a stream with your bare hands and things like this. Well, maybe that actually isn't so short. But because it wouldn't be successful, perhaps. So the shortest in time periods of production won't satisfy all of our ends. In order for that to be the case, we would have to engage in longer production processes. But remember, time preference implies then, given that fact, time preference implies that the longer production processes must be more productive. Otherwise, we would never undertake them, right? We would always go for the shortest production process if the longer ones were of equal productivity. Now, there are two ways in which longer production processes could be more productive. They could give us more of the same goods that are available with shorter production processes. So, for example, we could try to farm wheat with no capital goods at all. We could just hand sow the seed, hand pick the wheat, and so on. Or we could go through a longer production process where we engage in mining iron and making steel and producing size, or even longer production processes where we make mechanical equipment and so on, and produce more of the same good. And that's what compensates for our time preference. On the other hand, we could engage in longer production processes that make it possible for us to produce goods that we cannot produce with shorter production processes, like automobiles. There's no immediate short production process by which that can be done. Now remember, having said that, let me reiterate the point that Mises makes here, that for any given action that people undertake, they will always undertake this production with the shortest, most productive process available, known to them, and so on. And again, this implies that only the longer production processes are available for us to decide to undertake in addition to what we're already doing. Now, there could be, of course, let's say discoveries or intervening technological advances and so on that permit a new, short, and more productive process to be undertaken. But given all knowledge and all existing production processes, those will all be exhausted as fully as possible, the shortest, most productive processes. So that when we engage in capital accumulation, only longer and more productive processes will be available. One other point about time preference. As a praxeological concept, it's always future-looking. That is, we're always using it in a theoretical way to explain how people are acting, deciding to act in the world. It isn't mainly at least a concept that's useful for historical analysis. In fact, this was one of boehm-bawerk's errors that Mises pointed out. He argued that there was something like an average period of production that was important in these matters of capital and interest and so on. And Mises pointed out in Human Action that this is a mistake. This is backward looking. And these concepts of praxeology don't look backward. They're trying to explain how we're acting, which is always future looking. And then let me mention one last point about time preference before we go on to interest. This is what we might call exceptions to time preference. Now, Mises has a short list of these in Human Action. And at the outset, we can just say that all of these alleged exceptions to time preference are false. They're just apparent only. And in fact, we find in economic theorizing that oftentimes we face this same sort of problem where someone will try to demonstrate that your concept of time preference or some other concept is false by posing an example in which it seems not to work. This is done, just to give you another example, it's done for preferences in general. Let's take this case. It's often brought up by students in my class. You say that, you economists say, that preference is what guides action. Preference is what we manifest or demonstrate in action. But this must be wrong because it's pretty easy to come up with examples where people act against their, what do we want to call these, true preferences. Let's take a smoker. Someone who smokes cigarettes and he wants to quit. And he's always complaining about his smoking, regretting that he lights up and takes another cigarette. So how can we say that he's acting according to his preferences when he tells us that he doesn't like to smoke, but he continues to do it? See, it's a confusion between the praxeological concept of preference, which is bound up in his action, and this sort of psychological notion of preference, what we like or dislike or do and don't do in terms of regretting or not regretting. So the same kind of thing happens with, or a similar kind of thing at least, happens with time preference. We should be predisposed against these kinds of exceptions because they're typically they're typically not thinking about time preference in a praxeological way. So let me give you a few examples of this, just Mises' examples from human action. One example he gives is someone is presented 2 theater tickets for the same evening. And he says, boy, I wish I had the one of these theater tickets in tomorrow. He seems to prefer the future good to the present good. And as Mises points out, well, this is no violation of time preference. This is just a consequence of scarcity, right? That he can't have all present satisfactions at the same time. So there's no violation of time preference here. Time preference, remember, refers to the same satisfaction that can be had either in the present or in the future, now or later. Another example that he takes up is ice in winter and ice in summer, and the differing valuation. So in winter, people value ice less than they do in summer. So they say in wintertime it's cold and so on, and they say, ice in summer is more valuable to me. They seem to be placing greater value on a future good than the same good in the present. Now there are various answers to this, various ways one might think about this in a praxeological fashion. One answer would be that ice in winter, if it's related in this decision-making process to ice in summer, must simply be a complementary good. Right? If you're valuing the same ice in the winter as you plan to use in the summer, then the ice in the winter is just a factor of production by which you produce ice in the summer, eventually. And of course, it's always true that the good the final good, the direct good, the consumer good that you produce has a greater value than the factors of production. So that would be one way of addressing this. Another would be to point out that the whole situation of valuation is different. In fact, that's what makes the example plausible. Why do we think that somebody in the wintertime doesn't value ice as much as he does in the summer? Well, it's because in the summertime, a whole vista of possible uses of ice that are valuable are opened up that aren't available in winter. So we're obviously comparing 2 entirely different situations. Or the case may be that the uses of ice are all the same, even though we would think perhaps that not so. But the stock of ice in winter is greater than it is in the summer. And so we have a situation of diminishing marginal utility, right? We've got a huge stock of ice in the winter, and so we value it less than the smaller stock of ice that we have in the summer. We also need to keep in mind this principle of economizing by aiming our actions to occur at some point in time. That would be an alternative explanation. It may simply be that the person desires, for whatever reason, to employ ice in the summer. And therefore he places greater value on it simply because that's the time that he wishes to employ it as a means to satisfy some end. Okay, now let's move on to the rate of interest. If people have a preference for a satisfaction sooner as opposed to later, then this time preference can be manifested in what we call originary interest. And originary interest then would be the premium that people place on the present relative to the future, or what's equivalent, it would be the discount of the future that people have relative to the present. Let's say, for example, we have a person with a preference rank that looks like this. He values $1,000 today over $1,000 of equivalent purchasing power a year from today. This would be consistent with the notion of time But it may be possible, of course, to find some amount of money in the future that he would prefer to $1,000 today. Let's say, for example, that 1 year from today he would prefer $1,250 to $1,000 today. Then this person would place a $250 premium on the present. Or he would have a $250 discount of the future. Now, of course, as a rate, this would be 25%, right? It's $250 for $1,000. So we would say in this case that the originary rate of interest is 25%. You notice one other thing about this example. This interest rate is what makes, roughly speaking, present money equivalent in value to future money. It's the intertemporal rate of exchange between present money and future money. Okay, now time preference then is the basis for the market rate of interest. All we've spoken about so far is this originary rate of interest. We've shown, in other words, why there can be a market rate of interest. It stems from this universal preference that people have for sooner as opposed to later satisfactions. But in order to have a market rate of interest, we have to have exchange. We have to have a market, right? We have to have the time market, where present money is exchanged for future money. Now, in any market, there have to be reverse preferences. Right? The buyer has to place greater value on what he is to receive, and the seller what he is also to receive in exchange than what he gives up. So all exchange is predicated upon reverse preference. In this case, of course, it must be time preference that's reversed, so that we have demanders in this market that have higher time preference, as they're willing to pay large premiums in order to acquire present money in exchange for future money. And we have suppliers that have lower time preference, so they're willing to accept smaller premiums in order to give up present money in exchange for future money. So our person here with a 25% originary interest rate, the $250 premium, if he could come in contact with someone who is willing to accept, say, $150 to supply $1,000 to him for a year, then they can make a mutually advantageous trade at some interest rate between 25% and 15%. Right? And then, of course, the market rate of interest is set just like any price is set in any market, as we've spoken about before, by demand and supply, by just the competition among the buyers and sellers. The market rate of interest emerges. Now, just like in any market, since both sides of the market, both demand and supply, are ruled by preferences, then preferences determine not only prices in markets, but the quantity of the good that's bought and sold. As I say, they determine for the seller, they determine the revenue that the seller receives from selling the good, and they determine the cost that's or expense that the buyers incur in purchasing the good. Now, that's a rather mundane fact to point out about prices in general, but it's a rather important fact to point out in this market. To state it again, when we think about the time market, it's time preference that determines both the rate of interest, or at least it is the underlying rate of interest, the originary rate, and the amount of present money that's exchanged, the amount of lending and borrowing. That too is determined just by time preference, because time preference is what lies behind demand and supply. Now, just like all of the various conditions then that affect price in general in any market work through preferences. Right? So let's say housing prices go up because demand increases. And demand increases because people have more income. But it's preferences that allocate that additional income to housing demand as opposed to automobile demand or entertainment goods and services and so on. So it's always that these factors that lead to changes in the conditions of demand and supply work through preferences. That is, all of our action is always taking the external circumstances of our action and judging them with our mind, right? And then acting on the basis of that judgment. So the same thing happens in the time market. In the time market, all the various circumstances that affect the rate of interest do so through time preference. It's not that other factors don't affect interest, like objective factors don't affect the rate of interest, but they do so through our mental judgments. Because our mental judgments determine demand and supply. Let's say, for example, as a technological breakthrough that would cause the cost of production of some process to go down. And so an entrepreneur who's producing in this market, who has made this innovation, increases his demand for present money. He wants to borrow money in order to reap the benefit of this production process, greater profit from this production process. It's working through his time preference, right? We're just saying that his time preference has changed. His time preference has gone up because of this. Because he sees that if he acts in this way into the future, he'll reap a greater profit. He'll lower his costs and reap the difference as profit. Okay, so this to say this in one sentence, we treat interest and the principle of time preference the same way that we treat the general theory of price and the general concept of preference. We're just applying those concepts directly to this question of the rate of interest. Now, in the time market, there are two parts. We can break the time market into two parts. The first is the credit market. And the credit market is where there's trade of present money for a contractual claim to future money. That is to say, the transaction is incomplete until the future, and that's why it's called a credit transaction. And we're all familiar with credit transactions, like I've taken out a mortgage in order to build my house. And so that transaction is not completed, won't be completed for 15 years. Right? Pay my last mortgage payment. That's a credit transaction. Now, in the credit market, there are two subcomponents. One would be the consumer loan market, which then could be further broken down into auto loans and mortgage loans and credit card loans and so on. Here, the borrowed money goes to buy consumer goods. And then there's the producer loan market, where the borrowed money goes to buy capital goods. Entrepreneurs are running to the credit market to borrow money to buy capital. Then the second part of the time market is the structure of production. And in the structure of production, there's the trade of present money for factors of production that are then used to produce goods that are sold in the future for revenues so that those costs can be recouped. Notice here we don't have a credit transaction. We have two cash transactions. The entrepreneur buys the factors of production today or over some period of time of production. Then he produces the good, he owns the good, and he sells it to someone in the future. Again, a cash transaction. But time preference operates in the structure of production because of the time element involved in the structure of production, just like it does in the credit market. Now, when the entrepreneur, or we might call this person now a capitalist entrepreneur, the entrepreneur is putting up his own money in the production process, so he's acting as a capitalist. When the capitalist entrepreneur engages in this process then of buying factors of production in the present and then producing a good and selling that good in the future, he has to be compensated by the rate of interest. He has to earn the rate of interest, just like he would in a credit transaction, since this is part of the time market. Now, the way in which he earns this rate of interest is that the factor prices that he pays will be discounted to take account of time preference. So instead of paying a factor of production today, it's full marginal revenue product. Remember Dr. Salerno speaking about marginal revenue products of factors. An entrepreneur today will only pay a discounted marginal revenue product, a marginal revenue product discounted by the rate of interest. And then, of course, when he sells the good in the future, he reaps the full value, the full marginal revenue product when the good he produces is sold in the future. And the difference between the two, then, is the rate of interest that he earns by putting his capital into his production process. Let's take a numeric example. Say we have an entrepreneur with a production process, and he estimates these marginal revenue products. So he has a capital good with a marginal revenue product of $10,000. He has a natural resource with a marginal revenue product of $5,000. And he uses labor with a marginal revenue product of $2,500. And so this is his estimate of the value of these factors of production in making the consumer good, which he anticipates recouping when the consumer good is sold. So he estimates that in the production process then he has $17,500 that he'll recoup from the purchaser of the good that he's produced. So this is, we're assuming that this is the extent of his factors of production. Now, of course, he won't pay $17,500 for these factors of production today just to go through the production process to sell a good a year from today, let's say, and recoup $17,500. And he has time preference. He won't surrender the same amount of money in the present just to obtain that amount of money in the future. But the way in which he earns his interest, he doesn't have a credit transaction. He doesn't have a contract with someone who will pay him interest. So the way that he reaps his interest is by paying not the full marginal revenue product, but by discounting the marginal revenue product by the rate of interest. And let's just say that the rate of interest is 25%. Then he'll calculate the marginal revenue, the discounted marginal revenue products of these factors. For capital would be $8,000. For the natural resource, it would be $4,000. Right? This is just taking the marginal revenue product and dividing by 1.25. And for the labor factor, $2,000. So all in all here, he has $14,000. So today he pays the factors $14,000. A year from today he has a good that he sells for $17,500. Clearly then interest is part of what we might call, or what Mises calls, gross profit, or what accountants might call net income. In our example, he sells the good a year from today for $17,500. He paid a year ago $14,000 in his costs. He therefore gets an interest payment of $3,500, which is 25%, right? 3,500 divided by 14 is the 25% rate of interest. Now, of course, this is not the only element of gross profit for a capitalist who is an entrepreneur. That is, he's funding his own production process. Gross profit actually has three, or net income again, has three components. It has entrepreneurial profit, which he earns by correctly anticipating future demands and then satisfying them. The second component would be entrepreneurial wages. So if the entrepreneur supplies the production process with labor, then part of his net, since he's not paying someone for this labor, it's not an expense that shows on his accounts, it would show up in his net income. And then the third component is interest. Okay, now one more complication that we might notice here is that this rate of interest that I'm assuming is just the originary rate in this example is also subject to, when we think about the relationship between the originary rate and the market rate, is subject to some complicating comments. Let's just use the symbol little I to stand for the market rate. Then any particular market rate has these components. It has a pure originary rate in it, and that this pure component, as you might remember, we alluded to this, will be based in part upon the duration. So there isn't just one originary rate of interest. There's an originary rate for every time period. There's a 1-year originary rate, a 6-month originary rate, a 2-year originary rate, a 10-year originary rate, and so on. These would all be different because, as we mentioned before, there's a different rate of discount that people place on later and later satisfactions of their ends. And then a second element that Mises identifies here is an entrepreneurial uncertainty element, that each particular project has its own element of uncertainty in terms of reaping this interest rate, and therefore this component can vary from one production process to another. And then there's a purchasing power of money element that enters in because the purchasing power of money can vary from one point in time to another. So if the purchasing power of money is declining over this production process, then the market rate of interest would be higher to accommodate for that. So this is the general relationship, at least the conceptual relationship between the market rate and the pure rate. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is what in the literature is called the interest rate problem, or the problem of interest. And just briefly survey the different solutions that have been offered to this interest problem. The interest problem, which was identified by boehm-bawerk, is that the price of a capital good is not bid up equal to the stream of its lifetime marginal revenue product. To put this in symbolic form, the capital value of a durable good, or the price of it today, is not equal to the sum of the marginal revenue products over the duration of the life of the capital, where N is the number of periods that the capital generates marginal revenue product. In fact, it's less than this. Right, the purchase price is less than the sum of the marginal revenue products. Now, well, maybe I should state the implication. The implication of this is that the owner of the capital will reap this differential, right? Whoever owns the capital and puts it into production can pay a price today for it that's less than the revenue that he'll reap over the lifetime of owning this capital good. So it generates something like income to the capitalist. Now, as we've already seen, one solution to this would be time preference, which points out that this stream of income that accrues to the owner of the capital good is interest. That it exists precisely because no one is willing to pay, in my prior example, $17,500 today just to get back $17,500 by using a capital good or other factors of production a year from today. Those future marginal revenue products have to be discounted in order for their present price to be determined. So this is the time preference solution. We might also point out that time preference has the advantage over some of these others that I'll mention in that it explains all manifestations of interest. Time preference explains interest, as we mentioned, in the credit market. It explains interest in the structure of production. All through there aren't 2 or 3 or 4 different explanations that would be necessary to cover all cases. Okay, a second possible solution to this, and this one I will not pursue because I assume that you would reject it out of hand. This would be the Marxian argument that this differential comes from the exploitation of workers or exploitation of factor owners in the production process. So there's an exploitation explanation, which I won't even bother to discuss. A third is that there's a productivity of capital explanation. So here the explanation goes like this. Interest is the manifestation of the productive services of capital. Competition does not erode away this difference because it's necessary for the owner of capital to receive it as income to employ his capital. Now there are variations of this argument. And boehm-bawerk, of course, goes through this in his monumental work on capital and interest. There's what he called the naive productivity theory, which seems to attribute interest just to physical fecundity. Just the fact that capital produces things means that it has a rate of interest. But as we've seen, interest is really a problem of valuation, right? It's a problem of discovering the intertemporal rate of valuation between present things and future things. It's a value problem. It's a problem of how much, given the physical productivity of a capital good, how much will entrepreneurs pay to own it today, to put it into their production process? This is obviously a value problem. And if entrepreneurs are just bidding for the productivity of the capital, why wouldn't they bid their price all the way up to the point where the profit is eroded from owning the capital, right? Why do we get this net difference? And again, time preference can explain this. Physical productivity cannot. Now, there were variations on this argument about physical productivity, which were designed to sort of eliminate by default the possibility of time preference. These were attacks on time preference. And these arguments made various assumptions that were crucial. One, and I'll give you a numeric example of this in a minute, but one assumption of this kind of line of argument was that the capital stock grows at a fixed rate. So we have something like a capital good, that just by physical nature expands by, say, 10% per year. Cruisonian plants or stocks of rice and things like this. The second assumption is that we have a one-good economy. And this is the crucial assumption. If you have a one-good economy, then, and you make other assumptions by which you can't have exchange, then value productivity is, or appears to be, equated with physical productivity. In other words, you can calculate things like real rates of interest, right, where the value problem seems to be eclipsed. So the example that is often used in this line of argument is, I mentioned, say we have 100 units of rice, and it expands into 110 units of rice in 1 year. And it just perpetually does this, 10% more every year. And the argument is then that, well, you have this, this physical productivity of the rice. At the end of a year, you have 10 units of income, real income, right? And so on forever. So it seems that physical productivity alone is sufficient to explain this income. Now, what the Austrians have responded to this is the following. First, this income is not interest. Whatever we want to call this income, it's just the physical productivity of the capital good. Right? It's not interest. Interest is just the intertemporal valuation between the present and the future. Furthermore, the situation, of course, is designed to preclude interest from arising at all. You typically have one owner, like it has a Crusoean plant, or a pirate stranded on a desert island with 100 units of rice, who benefits from this physical productivity. So there's no trade, there's no valuation, right, in normal market valuation, and no intertemporal rate of exchange emerges. But it should be noted that even in the case where you have, say, Caruso owning this good that simply increases by 10% per year in its physical amount, while you don't have an intertemporal rate of exchange because there's no exchange with one owner, time preference still does rule Caruso's decisions regarding the rice. If he has, for example, very high time, he's on the verge of starvation or something, he thinks he's going to be saved in a month, then he will consume his capital. Right? He'll eat the rice. If he has a very low time preference, well, then he'll let the rice accumulate maybe. So it'll have more and more the next year. So these examples really don't apply to the problem of capital valuing. So let's amend the example to permit capital valuation. Now remember, what we have here is what in finance might be called a perpetuity. Right? We have an infinite stream of future income of 10 units of rice a year. And it's pretty easy. The formula for figuring out the present value of perpetuity is easy. You just take the marginal revenue product and divide by the rate of interest. That's how you do the discounting. So let's say that we had a market and there were people who could buy this 100 units of rice and sell it in markets. What would its capital value be? Well, clearly its capital value, that is what people would pay for it in the present, depends upon the rate of interest. It isn't solely determined by its productivity, right? Even in real terms. Let's say, for example, that the rate of interest were 10%. Well, if the rate of interest were 10%, then we have a 10-unit increase in rice, right, divided by the 10%. And so the capital value would be $100. What if it were 5%? Well, then it would be double, right? And somebody who bought this capital good, paying $200 for it, would earn exactly the rate of interest, right? You would earn 5%. That would be his rate of return. He would get 10 additional units of rice every year, but he had to pay $200 to get it in the first place. If the interest rate were twice as high as the original 10%, then the capital value is cut in half from its original level, right? This is what makes the rate of return on this investment in this particular capital good, so to speak, conform to the rate of interest. The rates of return on capital conform to the rate of interest, which is based on time preference. They are not independent from it. They do not set it. Okay, well, I have one more of these, but we're nearly out of time, so maybe I'll just stop here and take questions. Yes?
Can you maybe give us a short refutation of the Marxist labor theory of value? Because you did touch on it and then sort of decided not to enter into it, and I'm very curious to know the Austrian refutation.
Well, again, it was the achievement of boehm-bawerk on the labor theory of value. And this this argument, the exploitation argument, of course, is that it's possible for the capitalist to receive the full marginal revenue product from hiring a worker, but his costs of the price he pays, or the expense involved in hiring the worker, is subsistence. And so he'll reap any difference between the two as surplus value. The refutation, I guess the most simple way to state the refutation, I suppose, is that is to focus on this notion that the price of labor, or maybe any other factor, is somehow set by subsistence. Is this so? Is it really true that the price of a factor of production is based upon some kind of intrinsic value? And you've seen the Austrian refutation of that. No, the price of labor is determined by the entrepreneurial demand for it, which in turn is based upon it, that factor is precisely based upon that factor's marginal revenue product. And so it is true that the marginal revenue product is not, by this competition, bid completely up to the marginal revenue product because of the interest rate discount, but it certainly is not related to subsistence or to the notion that there's some kind of intrinsic value in the labor that has to be compensated, but nothing on, beyond that. Well, it's more to it than that, but it's sort of a short version.
Okay, let the choices begin. In 15 minutes, we start.